Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing abrupt climate change. And I am going to attempt to read the rest of this article for all of you continuing on with me. Thank you for hanging in there. I'm actually really interested in the history of this article. I'm a bit of a history fanatic, or maybe not fanatic, but I enjoy history very much. Lest I put myself in a spot where I start having to name names and dates, but I enjoy the historical aspect of this article, and it's very enlightening to find out that they knew what they knew when they knew it, and what they did about that. Of course, there are a lot of reaction pieces to this article. I don't know that I'm going to read any of them. I may try and get to some of them, but I don't want to spend like an entire week reading this article and then reading all the reactions to it. There's lots of news to cover. Climate change keeps on rearing its ugly head, and there's lots going on, and so I don't want to get lost in this tunnel of just this article and all things about this article. So what I would like to do is get through this article, the rest of it, and then move on to covering the news of climate change on a daily basis as best I can. If I can get to some of those other articles or parts of those other articles, I will do so. So this, hopefully, I think what I'm going to do is just read until this is done. I don't know how long that's going to take. This video may end up being very, very long. I can already see that the sync on my talking is out a little bit, so I'm going to try and alleviate that, but by the end of the video, it may not be in very good shape. So just, if you will, bear with me on that. So I'm going to pick up, or maybe I won't, where I left off. I'm going to read the last paragraph I read yesterday and continue on. And this is, again, Losing Earth, the Decade We Almost Stopped Climate Change, from the New York Times. Meanwhile, the Charney Report continued to vibrate at the periphery of public consciousness. Its conclusions were confirmed by major studies from the Aspen Institute, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis near Vienna, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Every month or so, nationally syndicated articles appeared summoning apocalypse, another warning on greenhouse effect, global warming trend beyond human experience. Warming trend could pit nation against nation. People magazine had profiled Gordon MacDonald, photographing him standing on the steps of the Capitol and pointing above his head to the level the water would reach when the polar ice caps melted. If Gordon MacDonald is wrong, they'll laugh, the article read, otherwise they'll gurgle. But Pomerantz understood that in order to sustain major coverage, you needed major events. Studies were fine, speeches were good, news conferences were better. Hearings, however, were best. The ritual's theatrical trappings, the members of Congress holding forth on their dais, their aides decorously passing notes, the witnesses sipping nervously from their water glasses, the audience transfixed in the gallery, offered antagonists, dramatic tension, narrative. But you couldn't have a hearing without a scandal, or at least a scientific breakthrough. And 2 years after the Charney Group met at Woods Hole, it seemed there was no more science to break through. It was with a shiver of optimism then that Pomerantz read on the front page of the New York Times on August 22nd, 1981, about a forthcoming paper in Science by a team of 7 NASA scientists. They had found that the world had already warmed in the past century. Temperatures hadn't increased beyond the range of historical averages, but the scientists predicted that the warming signal would emerge from the noise of routine weather fluctuations much sooner than previously expected. Most unusual of all, the paper ended with a policy recommendation. In the coming decades, the authors wrote, Humankind should develop alternative sources of energy and use fossil fuels only as necessary. The lead author was James Hansen. Pomerantz called Hansen to ask for a meeting. He explained to Hansen that he wanted to make sure he understood the paper's conclusions. More than that, he wanted to understand James Hansen. At the Goddard Institute, Pomerantz entered Hansen's office, maneuvering through some 30 piles of documents arrayed across the floor like the skyscrapers of a model city, some as high as his waist. On top of many of the stacks lay a scrap of cardboard on which had been scrawled words like trace gases, ocean, Jupiter, Venus. At the desk, Pomerantz found hidden behind another paper metropolis, a quiet, composed man with a heavy brow and implacable green eyes. Hansen's speech was soft, equable, deliberate to the point of halting. He would have no trouble passing for a small-town accountant, insurance claims manager, or actuary. In a sense, he held all of these jobs, only his client was the global atmosphere. Pomerantz's political sensitivity sparked. He liked what he saw. As Hansen spoke, Pomerantz listened and watched. He understood Hansen's basic findings well enough. Earth had been warming since 1880, and the warming would reach almost unprecedented magnitude in the next century, leading to the familiar suite of terrors, including the flooding of a tenth of New Jersey and a quarter of Louisiana and Florida. But Pomerantz was excited to find that Hansen could translate the complexities of atmospheric science into plain English. Though he was something of a wunderkind, at 40, he was about to be named director of the Goddard Institute. He spoke with the plain-spoken Midwestern forthrightness that played on Capitol Hill. He presented like a heartland voter, the kind of man interviewed on the evening news about the state of the American dream or photographed in the dying sun against a blurry agricultural landscape in a campaign ad. And unlike most scientists in the field, he was not afraid to follow his research to its policy implications. He was perfect. What you have to say needs to be heard, Pomerantz said. Are you willing to be a witness? Seven, we are all going to be the victims, March 1982. Though few people other than Rafe Pomerantz seem to have noticed amid Reagan's environmental blitzkrieg, another hearing on the greenhouse effect was held several weeks earlier on July 31st, 1981. It was led by Representative James Schuer, a New York Democrat, who lived at sea level on the Rockaway Peninsula in a neighborhood no more than 4 blocks wide, sandwiched between two beaches, and a canny 33-year-old congressman named Albert Gore, Jr. Gore had learned about climate change a dozen years earlier as an undergraduate at Harvard, when he took a class taught by Roger Revelle. Humankind was on the brink of radically transforming the global atmosphere. Revelle explained, drawing Keeling's rising zigzag on the blackboard and risked bringing about collapse of civilization. Gore was stunned. Why wasn't anyone talking about this? He had no memory of hearing it from his father, a 3-term senator from Tennessee who later served as chairman of an Ohio coal company. Once in office, Gore figured that if Revelle gave Congress the same lecture, his colleagues would be moved to act, or at least that the hearing would get picked up by one of the 3 major national news broadcasts. Gore's hearing was part of a larger campaign he had designed with the staff director, Tom Grumley. After winning his 3rd term in 1980, Gore was granted his first leadership position, albeit a modest one, chairman of an oversight subcommittee within the Committee on Science and Technology, a subcommittee that he lobbied to create. Most in Congress considered the Science Committee a legislative backwater, if they considered it at all. This made Gore's subcommittee, which had no legislative authority, an afterthought to an afterthought. That Gore vowed would change. Environmental and health stories had all the elements of narrative drama, villains, victims, and heroes. In a hearing, you could summon all 3, with the chairman serving as narrator, chorus, and moral authority. He told his staff director that he wanted to hold a hearing every week. It was like storyboarding episodes of a weekly procedural drama. Grumley assembled a list of subjects that possessed the necessary dramatic elements. A Massachusetts cancer researcher who faked his results, the dangers of excessive salt in the American diet, the disappearance of an airplane on Long Island. All fit Gore's template, all had sizzle. But Gore wondered why Grumley hadn't included the greenhouse effect. There are no villains, Grumley said. Besides, who's your victim? If we don't do something, Gore replied, we're all going to be the victims. He didn't say, if we don't do something, we'll be the villains too. The Revell hearing went as Grumbly had predicted. The urgency of the issue was lost on Gore's older colleagues, who drifted in and out while the witnesses testified. There were a few people left by the time the Brookings Institution economist Lester Lave warned that humankind's profligate exploitation of fossil fuels posed an existential test to human nature. Carbon dioxide stands as a symbol now of our willingness to confront the future, he said. It will be a sad day when we decide that we just don't have the time or thoughtfulness to address those issues. That night, the news programs featured the resolution of the baseball strike, the ongoing budgetary debate, and national surplus of butter. But Gore soon found another opening. Congressional staff members on the Science Committee had heard that the White House planned to eliminate the Energy Department's carbon dioxide program. If they could put a hearing together quickly enough, they could shame the White House before it could go through with its plan. The Times article about Hansen's paper had proved that there was a national audience for the carbon dioxide problem. It just had to be framed correctly. Hansen could occupy the role of hero, a mild-mannered scientist who had seen the future and now sought to rouse the world to action. A villain was emerging too. Fred Kumanoff, Reagan's new director of the Energy Department's carbon dioxide program, a Bronx native with a manner of a sergeant major and an unconstrained passion for budget cutting, each man would testify. Hansen did not disclose to Gore's staff that in late November he received a letter from Kumanoff declining to fund his climate modeling research despite a promise from Kumanoff's predecessor. Kumanoff left open the possibility of funding another carbon dioxide research, but Hansen was not optimistic. And when his funding lapsed, he had to release 5 employees, half his staff. Kumanoff, it seemed, would not be moved, but the hearing would give Hansen the chance to appeal directly to the congressman who oversaw Kumanoff's budget. Hansen flew to Washington to testify on March 25, 1982, performing before a gallery even more thinly populated than at Gore's first hearing on the greenhouse effect. Gore began by attacking the Reagan administration for cutting funding for carbon dioxide research, despite the broad consensus in the scientific community that the greenhouse effect is a reality. William Carney, a Republican from New York, bemoaned the burning of fossil fuels and argued passionately that science should serve as the basis for legislative policy. Bob Szymanski, a Democrat from Ohio, objected to the use of the term greenhouse effect for such a horrifying phenomenon because he had always enjoyed visiting greenhouses. Everything, he said, seems to flourish in there. He suggested that they call it the microwave oven effect because we are not flourishing too well under this. Apparently, we are getting cooked. Yeah, good idea, Szymanski. There emerged, despite the general comedy, a partisan divide. Unlike the Democrats, the Republicans demanded action. Interesting. Today, I have a sense of deja vu, said Robert Walker, a Republican from Pennsylvania. In each of the last 5 years, he said, we've been told and told and told that there is a problem with the increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We all accept that fact, and we realize that the potential consequences are certainly major in their impact on mankind. Yet they had failed to propose a single law. Now is the time, he said. The research is clear. It is up to us now to summon the political will. Gore disagreed. A higher degree of certainty was required, he believed, in order to persuade a majority of Congress to restrict the use of fossil fuels. The reforms required were of such magnitude and sweep that they would challenge the political will of our civilization. Yet the experts invited by Gore agreed with the Republicans. The science was certain enough. Melvin Calvin, a Berkeley chemist who won the Nobel Prize for his work on the carbon cycle, said that it was useless to wait for stronger evidence of warming. You cannot do a thing about it when signals are so big that they come out of the noise. He said, you have to look for early warning signs. Hansen's job was to share the warning signs, to translate the data into plain English. He explained a few discoveries that his team had made, not with computer models, but in libraries. By analyzing records from hundreds of weather stations, he found that the surface temperature of the planet had already increased 0.4 of a degree Celsius in the previous century. Data from several hundred tide gauge stations show that the oceans had risen 4 inches since the 1880s. 4 inches. Most disturbing of all, century-old glass astronomy plates had revealed a new problem. Some of the more obscure greenhouse gases, especially chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, a class of man-made substances used in refrigerators and spray cans, had proliferated wildly in recent years. We may already have in the pipeline a larger amount of climate change than people generally realize, Hansen told the nearly empty room. Gore asked when the planet would reach a point of no return, a trigger point, after which temperatures would spike. I want to know, Gore said, whether I'm going to face it or my kids are going to face it. Your kids are likely to face it, Calvin replied. I don't know whether you will or not. You look pretty young. It occurred to Hansen that this was the only political question that mattered. How long until the worst began? It was not a question of which geophysicists expended much effort. The difference between 5 years and 50 years in the future was meaningless in geological time. Politicians were capable of thinking only in terms of electoral time, 6 years, 4 years, 2 years. But when it came to the carbon problem, the two schemes were converging. Within 10 or 20 years, Hansen said, we will see climate changes which are clearly larger than the natural variability. James Shower wanted to make sure he understood this correctly. No one else had predicted that the signal would emerge that quickly. If it were 1 or 2 degrees per century, he said, then that would be within the range of human adaptability, but we are pushing beyond the range of human adaptability. Yes, Hansen said. How soon, Shower asked. Would they have to change the national model of energy production? Hansen hesitated. It wasn't a scientific question, but he couldn't help himself. He had been irritated during the hearing by all the ludicrous talk about the possibility of growing more trees to offset emissions. False hopes were worse than no hope at all. They undermined the prospect of developing real solutions. Boom. That time is very soon, Hansen said finally. My opinion is that it is past, Calvin said, but he was not heard because he spoke from his seat. He was told to speak into the microphone. It is already later, Calvin said, than you think. 8. The direction of an impending catastrophe, 1982. Catastrophe, 1982. From Gore's perspective, the hearing was an unequivocal success. That night, Dan Rather devoted 3 minutes of CBS Evening News to the greenhouse effect. Correspondent explained that temperatures had increased over the previous century. Great sheets of pack ice in Antarctica were rapidly melting. The seas were rising. Calvin said that the trend is all in the direction of an impending catastrophe. And Gore mocked Reagan for his short-sightedness. Later, Gore would take credit for protecting the Energy Department's carbon dioxide program, which in the end was largely preserved. But Hansen did not get new funding for his carbon dioxide research. He wondered whether he had been doomed by his testimony or by his conclusion in the science paper that full exploitation of coal resources, the stated goal of Reagan's energy policy, was undesirable. Whatever the cause, he found himself alone. He knew he had done nothing wrong. He had only done diligent research and reported his findings, first to his peers, then to the American people. But now it seemed as if he was being punished for it. Ania could read his disappointment, but she was not entirely displeased. Jim cut down his work hours, leaving the Goddard Institute at 5 o'clock each day, which allowed him to coach his children's basketball and baseball teams. He was a patient, committed coach, detail-oriented, if a touch too competitive for his wife's liking. At home, Jim spoke only about the teams and their fortunes, keeping to himself his musings, whether he would be able to secure federal funding for his climate experiments, whether the Institute would be forced to move its office to Maryland to cut costs. But perhaps there were other ways forward. Not long after Hansen laid off 5 of his assistants, a major symposium he was helping to organize received overtures from a funding partner far wealthier and less ideologically blinkered than the Reagan administration, Exxon. Following Henry Shaw's recommendation to establish credibility ahead of any future legislative battles, Exxon had begun to spend conspicuously on global warming research. It donated tens of thousands of dollars to some of the most prominent research efforts, including one at Woods Hole led by the ecologist George Woodwell, who had been calling for major climate policy as early as the mid-1970s, and an international effort coordinated by the United Nations. Now Shaw offered to fund the October 1982 Symposium on Climate Change at Columbia's Lamont Doherty campus. As an indication of the seriousness with which Exxon took the issue, Shaw sent Edward David Jr., the president of the research division and the former science advisor to Nixon. Hansen was glad for the support. He figured that Exxon's contributions might go well beyond picking up the bill for travel expenses, lodging, and a dinner for dozens of scientists at the colonial-style Clinton Inn in Tenafly, New Jersey. As a gesture of appreciation, David was invited to give the keynote address. I don't know if Tenafly or Tenafly, I don't know which way that's pronounced. I'm sorry if I'm messing that up. There were moments in David's speech in which he seemed to channel Rafe Pomerantz. David boasted that Exxon would usher in a new global energy system to save the planet from the ravages of climate change. He went so far as to argue that capitalism's blind faith in the wisdom of the free market was less than satisfying when it came to the greenhouse effect. Ethical considerations were necessary too. He pledged that Exxon would revise its corporate strategy to account for climate change, even if it were not fashionable to do so. As Exxon had already made heavy investments in nuclear and solar technology, he was generally upbeat that Exxon would invent a future of renewable energy. Hansen had reason to feel upbeat himself. If the world's largest oil and gas company supported a new national energy model, the White House would not stand in its way. The Reagan administration was hostile to change from within its ranks, but it wouldn't be hostile to Exxon. It seemed that something was beginning to turn. With the carbon dioxide problem, as with other environmental crises, the Reagan administration had alienated many of its own supporters. The early demonstrations of autocratic force had retreated into compromise and deference. By the end of 1982, multiple congressional committees were investigating Ann Gorsuch for her indifference to enforcing the cleanup of Superfund sites, and the House voted to hold her in contempt of Congress. Republicans in Congress turned on James Watt after he eliminated thousands of acres of land from consideration for wilderness designation. Each cabinet member would resign within a year. The carbon dioxide issue was beginning to receive major national attention. Hansen's own findings had become front-page news after all. What started as a scientific story was turning into a political story. The prospect would have alarmed Hansen several years earlier. It still made him uneasy. But he was beginning to understand that politics offered freedoms that the rigors of the scientific ethic denied. The political realm was itself a kind of mirror world, a parallel reality that crudely mimicked our own. It shared many of our most fundamental laws, like the laws of gravity and inertia and publicity. If you applied enough pressure, the mirror world of politics could be sped forward to reveal a new future. Hansen was beginning to understand that too. All right, guys, so I just kind of took in about how much the end of the rest of the story, how long it goes, and it's really, really, really long. So I think I've committed to a whole lot of reading. That's okay, but I'm probably not going to finish the whole thing today. So you probably will get a part 4. I may have to try and double up with some other just regular old climate news videos because this is going to drag on and on. I think it's important, though. I think this is an important read. I would like to have this whole read on my channel. If, you know, people ever want to listen to it, it's kind of nice to be able to put something on for a really long time. Kind of, you know, if you're doing like a day trip somewhere, or, you know, maybe you've got a project you're working on that's lengthy, you can just put this on and listen. So maybe what I'll do is make a little, what do you call that? Make a little folder for these videos and have them all together so they'll just play one after the other. So I'm going to get back to reading this. This is part 2 of this Losing Earth. Part 2, 1983 to 1989. 1. Caution, not panic, 1983 to 1984. From a stray comment in an obscure poll report to portentous front-page headlines in the national press and hearings on Capitol Hill, in just 3 years, Rafe Pomerantz had watched an issue considered esoteric even within the scientific community rose nearly to the level of action, the level at which congressmen made statements like, "It is up to us now to summon the political will." Then, overnight, it died. Pomerantz knew, from tired experience, that politics didn't move in a straight line, but jaggedly like the Keeling curve. A slow progression interrupted by sharp seasonal declines. But in the fall of 1983, the climate issue entered an especially long, dark winter, and all because of a single report that had done nothing to change the state of climate science, but transformed the state of climate politics. After the publication of the Charney Report in 1979, Jimmy Carter had directed the National Academy of Sciences to prepare a comprehensive $1 million analysis of the carbon dioxide problem. A Warren Commission for the Greenhouse Effect. A team of scientist dignitaries, among them Ravel, the Princeton modeler Syukuro Manabe, and the Harvard political economist Thomas Schelling, one of the intellectual architects of the Cold War game theory, would review the literature, evaluate the consequences of global warming for the world order, and propose remedies. Then Reagan won the White House. For the next 3 years, as the commission continued its work, drawing upon the help of about 70 experts from the fields of atmospheric chemistry, economics, and political science, including veterans from the Charney Group and the Manhattan Project, the incipient report served as the Reagan administration's answer to every question on the subject. There could be no climate policy, Fred Kumanoff and his associates said, until the Academy ruled. In the mirror world of the Reagan administration, the warming problem hadn't been abandoned at all. A careful, comprehensive solution was being devised. Everyone just had to wait for the Academy's elders to explain what it was. On October 19th, 1983, the commission finally announced its findings at a formal gala, preceded by cocktails and dinner in the Academy's cruciform Great Hall, a secular Sistine chapel with vaulted ceilings soaring to a dome painted as the sun. An inscription encircling the sun honored science as the pilot of industry, and the Academy had invited the nation's foremost pilots of industry, Andrew Caligari, the head of Exxon's carbon dioxide research program, and vice presidents from Peabody Coal, General Motors, and the Synthetic Fuels Corporation. They were eager to learn how the United States planned to act, so they could prepare for the inevitable policy debates. Rafe Pomerantz was eager too, but he wasn't invited. He did manage, however, to get into a crowded press briefing earlier that day, where he grabbed a copy of the 500-page report, Changing Climate, and scanned its contents. Its scope was impressive. It was the first study to encompass the causes, effects, and geopolitical consequences of climate change. But as he flipped through, Pomerantz surmised that it offered no significant new findings, nothing that wasn't in the Charney Report or the Blue Ribbon studies that had been published since. We are deeply concerned about environmental changes of this magnitude, read the executive summary. We may get into trouble in ways that we have barely imagined. The authors did try to imagine some of them, an ice-free Arctic, for instance, and Boston sinking into its harbor, Beacon Hill, an island 2 miles off the coast. There was speculation about political revolution, trade wars, and a long quotation from A Distant Mirror, a medieval history written by Pomerantz's aunt, Barbara Tuchman, describing how climate changes in the 14th century led to people eating their own children and feeding on hanged bodies taken down from the gibbet. The committee's chairman, William Nierenberg, a Jason, presidential advisor and director of Scripps, the nation's preeminent oceanographic institute, argued that action had to be taken immediately before all the details could be known with certainty, or else it would be too late. That's what Nierenberg wrote in The Changing Climate. But it's not what he said in the press interviews that followed. He argued the opposite, that there was no urgent need for action. The public should not entertain the most extreme negative speculations about climate change, despite the fact that many of those speculations appeared in his report. Though Changing Climate urged an accelerated transition to renewable fuels, noting that it would take thousands of years for the atmosphere to recover from the damage of the last century, Nierenberg recommended caution, not panic. Better to wait and see. Better to bet on American ingenuity to save the day. Major interventions in national energy policy taken immediately might end up being more expensive and less effective than actions taken decades in the future, after more was understood about the economic and social consequences of a warmer planet. Yes, the climate would change, mostly for the worst, but future generations would be better equipped to change with it. As Pomerantz listened at the briefing to the commission's appeasements, he glanced, baffled, around the room. The reporters and staff members listened politely to the presentation and took dutiful notes, and as at any technical briefing. Government officials who knew Nuremberg were not surprised by his conclusions. He was an optimist by training and experience, a devout believer in the doctrine of American exceptionalism, and one of the elite class of scientists who helped the nation win a global war, invent the most deadly weapon conceivable, and create the booming aerospace and computer industries. America had solved every existential problem it had confronted over the previous generation. It would not be daunted by an excess of carbon dioxide. Nuremberg had also served on Reagan's transition team. Nobody believed that he had been directly influenced by his political connections, but his views, optimistic about the saving graces of market forces, pessimistic about the value of government regulation, reflected all the ardor of his party. Pomerantz, who came of age during the Vietnam War and the birth of the environmental movement, shared none of Nuremberg's Procrustean faith in American ingenuity. He worried about the dark undertow of industrial advancement, the way every new technological superpower carried within it unintended consequences that, if unchecked over time, eroded the foundations of society. New technologies had not solved the clean air and clean water crisis of the 1970s. Activism and organization, leading to robust government regulation, had. Listening to the commission's equivocations, Pomerantz shook his head, rolled his eyes, and groaned. He felt that he was the only sane person in a briefing room gone mad. It was wrong. A colleague told him to calm down. The damage of changing climate was squared by the amount of attention it received. Nuremberg's speech in the Great Hall, being 1/500th the length of the actual assessment, received 500 times the press coverage. As the Wall Street Journal put it, in a line echoed by trade journals across the nation, a panel of top scientists has some advice for people worried about the much publicized warming of the Earth's climate. You can cope. The effusiveness of Nuremberg's reassurances invited derision. On CBS Evening News, Dan Rather said the Academy had given a cold shoulder to a grim 200-page EPA assessment published earlier that week titled, "Can We Delay a Greenhouse Warming?" The EPA's answer, reduced to a word, was no. The Washington Post described the two reports, taken together, as clarion calls to inaction. On its front page, New York Times published its most prominent piece on global warming to date, under the headline, "Haste on Global Warming Trend is Opposed." Although the paper included an excerpt from Changing Climate that detailed some of the report's gloomier predictions, the article itself gave the greatest weight to its statement. Heavily workshopped by the White House's senior staff from George Keyworth II, Reagan's science advisor, Keyworth used Nuremberg's optimism as a reason to discount the EPA's unwarranted and unnecessarily alarmist report, and warned against taking any near-term corrective action on global warming. Just in case it wasn't clear, Keyworth added, there are no actions recommended other than continued research. Sound familiar? Exxon soon revised its position on climate change research. In a presentation at an industry conference, Henry Shaw cited changing climate as evidence that the general consensus is that society has sufficient time to technologically adapt to a CO2 greenhouse effect. If the Academy had concluded that regulations were not a serious option, why should Exxon protest? Edward David Jr., 2 years removed from boasting of Exxon's commitment to transforming global energy policy, told science that the corporation had reconsidered. Exxon has reverted to being mainly a supplier of conventional hydrocarbon fuels, petroleum products, natural gas, and steam coal, David said. The American Petroleum Institute canceled its own carbon dioxide research program too. A few months after the publication of Changing Climate, Pomerantz announced his resignation from Friends of the Earth. He had various reasons. He had struggled with the politics of managing a staff and a board, and the environment movement from which the organization had emerged in the early 70s was in crisis. It lacked a unifying cause. Climate change, Pomerantz believed, could be that cause, but its insubstantiality made it difficult to rally the older activists, whose strategic model relied on protests at sites of horrific degradation. Love Canal, Hetch Hetchy, 3 Mile Island. How did you protest when the toxic waste dump was the entire planet, or worse, its invisible atmosphere? Observing her husband, Lenore Pomerantz was reminded of an old Philadelphia Bulletin ad campaign. In Philadelphia, nearly everyone reads the Bulletin. On a crowded beach, all the sunbathers have their faces buried in their newspapers, except for one man who stares off into the distance. Here, the scenario was reversed. Rafe, the loner, was staring down the world's largest problem while everyone else was distracted by the minutiae of daily life. Pomerantz acted cheerful at home, fooling his kids, but he couldn't fool Lenore. She worried about his health. Near the end of his tenure at Friends of the Earth, the doctor found that he had an abnormally high heart rate. Pomerantz planned to take a couple of months to reflect on what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. 2 months stretched to about a year. He brooded. He checked out. He spent weeks at a time at an old farmhouse that he and Lenore owned in West Virginia near Seneca Rocks. When they bought it in the early 1970s, the house had a wood-burning stove and no running water. To make a phone call on a private line, you had to drive to the operator's house and hope she was in. Pomerantz sat in the cold house and thought. The winter took him back to his childhood in Greenwich. He had a vivid memory of being taught by his mother to ice skate on a frozen pond a short walk from their home. He remembered the muffled hush of twilight, the snow dusting the ice, the ghostly clearing encircled by a wood darker than the night. Their house was designed by his father, an architect whose glass-enveloped buildings mocked the vanity of humankind's efforts to improve on nature. The windows invited the elements inside, the trees and the ice, and in the rattling of the broad panes, the wind. Winter, Pomerantz believed, was part of his soul. When he thought about the future, he worried about the loss of ice, the loss of the spiky Connecticut January mornings. He worried about the loss of some irreplaceable part of himself. He wanted to recommit himself to the fight, but couldn't figure out how. If science, industry, and the press could not move the government to act, then who could? He didn't see what was left for him or anyone else to do. He didn't see that the answer was at that moment floating over his head, about 10 miles above his West Virginia farmhouse, just above the highest clouds. 2. You Scientists Win, 1985. It was as if, without warning, the sky opened and the sun burst through in all its irradiating, blinding fury. The mental image was a pin stick through a balloon, a chink in an eggshell, a crack in the ceiling, Armageddon descending from above. It was a sudden global emergency. There was a hole in the ozone layer. The klaxon was rung by a team of British government scientists, until then little known in the field, who made regular visits to research stations in Antarctica, one on the Argentine islands, the other on a sheet of ice floating into the sea at the rate of a quarter mile per year. At each site, the scientists had set up a machine invented in the 1920s called the Dobson spectrophotometer, which resembled a large slide projector turned with its eye staring straight up. After several years of results so alarming that they disbelieved their own evidence, the British scientists at last reported their discovery in an article published in May 1985 by Nature. The spring values of total O3 in Antarctica have now fallen considerably, the abstract read. But by the time the news filtered into the national headlines and television broadcasts several months later, it had transfigured into something far more terrifying: a substantial increase in skin cancer, a sharp decline in the global agricultural yield, and the mass death of fish larvae near the base of the marine food chain. Later came fears of atrophied immune systems and blindness. The urgency of the alarm seemed to have everything to do with the phrase, a hole in the ozone layer, which, charitably put, was a mixed metaphor, for there was no hole and there was no layer. Ozone, which shielded Earth from ultraviolet radiation, was distributed throughout the atmosphere, settling mostly in the middle stratosphere and never in a concentration higher than 15 parts per million. As for the hole, while the amount of ozone over Antarctica had declined drastically, the depletion was a temporary phenomenon, lasting about 2 months a year. In satellite images, colorized to show ozone density, however, the darker region appeared to depict avoid. When F. Sherwood Rowland, one of the chemists who identified the problem in 1974, spoke of the ozone hole in a university slide lecture in November 1985, the crisis found its catchphrase. The New York Times used it the same day in its article about the British team's findings. And while scientific journals initially refused to use the term, within a year it was unavoidable. The ozone crisis had its signal, which was also a symbol, a hole. It was already understood, thanks to the work of Rowland and his colleague Mario Molina, that the damage was largely caused by the man-made CFCs used in refrigerators, spray bottles, and plastic foams, which escaped into the stratosphere and devoured ozone molecules. It was also understood that the ozone problem and the greenhouse gas problem were linked. CFCs were unusually potent greenhouse gases. Though CFCs had been mass-produced only since the 1930s, they were already responsible by Jim Hansen's calculation for nearly half of Earth's warming during the 1970s, but nobody was worried about CFCs because of their warming potential. They were worried about getting skin cancer. The United Nations, through two of its intergovernmental agencies, the United Nations Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization, had in 1977 established a World Plan of Action on the ozone layer. In 1985, UNEP adopted a framework for a global treaty, the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer. The negotiators failed to agree upon any specific CFC regulations in Vienna, but after the British scientists reported their findings from the Antarctic 2 months later, the Reagan administration proposed a reduction in CFC emissions of 95%. The speed of the reversal was all the more remarkable because CFC regulation faced virulent opposition. Dozens of American businesses with the word refrigeration in their names, together with hundreds involved in the production, manufacture, and consumption of chemicals, plastics, paper goods, and frozen food, around 500 companies in total, from DuPont and the American Petroleum Institute to Mrs. Smith's Frozen Foods Company of Pottstown, Pennsylvania, had united in 1980 as the Alliance for Responsible CFC Policy. The alliance hounded the EPA members of Congress and Reagan himself, insisting that ozone science was uncertain. The few concessions the alliance won, like forcing the EPA to withdraw a plan to regulate CFCs, were swiftly overturned by lawsuits. And once the public discovered the ozone hole, every relevant government agency and every sitting United States senator urged the president to endorse the United Nations plan for a treaty. When Reagan finally submitted the Vienna Convention to the Senate for ratification, he praised the leading role played by the United States, fooling nobody. Senior members of the United Nations Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization, including Bert Bolin, a veteran of the Charney Group, began to wonder whether they could do for the carbon dioxide problem what they had done for the ozone policy. The organizations had been holding semi-annual conferences on global warming since the early 1970s. But in 1985, just several months after the bad news from the Antarctic, at an otherwise sleepy meeting, not a sloppy meeting, in Villach, Austria, the assembled 89 scientists from 29 countries began to discuss a subject that fell wildly outside their discipline: politics. An Irish hydrology expert asked if his country should reconsider the location of its dams. A Dutch seacoast engineer questioned the wisdom of rebuilding dikes that had been destroyed by recent floods. And the conference chairman, James Bruce, an unassuming, pragmatic hydrometeorologist from Ontario, posed a question that shocked his audience. Bruce was a minister of the Canadian Environmental Agency, a position that conferred him the esteem that his American counterparts had forfeited when Reagan won the White House. Just before leaving for Villach, he met with provincial dam and hydropower managers. "Okay," one of them said, "you scientists win. You've convinced me that the climate is changing. Well, tell me how it's changing. In 20 years, will the rain be falling somewhere else?" Bruce took his challenge to Villach. "You're the experts. What am I supposed to tell him? People are hearing the message and they want to hear more. So how do we, in the scientific world, begin a dialogue with the world of action?" The world of action. For a room of scientists who prided themselves as belonging to a specialized guild of monkish austerity, this was a startling provocation. On a bus tour from the countryside commissioned by their Austrian hosts, Bruce sat with Roger Revelle, ignoring the Alps, speaking animatedly about the need for scientists to demand political remedies in time of existential crisis. The formal report, ratified at Villach, contained the most forceful warnings yet issued by a scientific body. Most major economic decisions undertaken by nations, it pointed out, were based on the assumption that past climate conditions were a reliable guide to the future. But the future would not look like the past. Though some warming was inevitable, the scientists wrote, the extent of the disaster could be profoundly affected by aggressive, coordinated government policies. Fortunately, there was a new model in place just to achieve that. The balloon could be patched, the eggshell bandaged, the ceiling replastered. There was still time. Three, the size of the human imagination, spring, summer 1986. It was the spring of 1986, and Curtis Moore, a Republican staff member on the Committee on Environment and Public Works, was telling Rafe Pomerantz that the greenhouse effect wasn't a problem. With his last ounce of patience, Pomerantz begged to disagree. Yes, Moore clarified, of course, it was an existential problem. The fate of the civilization depended on it. The oceans would boil, all of that. But it wasn't a political problem. Know how you could tell? Political problems had solutions, and the climate issue had none. Without a solution, an obvious, attainable one, any policy could only fail. No elected politician desired to come within shouting distance of failure. So when it came to the dangers of despoiling our planet beyond the range of habitability, most politicians didn't see a problem, which meant that Pomerantz had a very big problem indeed. He had followed the rapid ascension of the ozone issue with the rueful admiration of a competitor. He was thrilled for its success. However, inadvertently, the treaty would serve as the world's first action to delay climate change. But it offered an especially acute challenge for Pomerantz, who after his year-long hiatus had become, as far as he knew, the nation's first and only full-time global warming lobbyist. At the suggestion of Gordon MacDonald, Pomerantz joined the World Resources Institute, a nonprofit begun by Gus Speth, a senior environmental official in Jimmy Carter's White House and a founder of the Natural Resources Defense Council. Unlike Friends of the Earth, WRI was not an activist organization. It occupied the nebulous intersection of politics, international relations, and energy policy. Its mission was expansive, enough to allow Pomerantz to work without interference. Yet the only thing that anyone on Capitol Hill wanted to talk about was ozone. That was Curtis Moore's proposal. Use ozone to revive climate. The ozone hole had a solution, an international treaty already in negotiation. Why not hitch the milk wagon to the bullet train? Pomerantz was skeptical. The problems were related, sure. Without a reduction in CFC emissions, you didn't have a chance of averting cataclysmic global warming. But it had been difficult enough to explain the carbon issue to politicians and journalists. Why complicate the sales pitch? Then again, he didn't see what choice he had. The Republicans controlled the Senate, and Moore was his connection to the Senate's Environmental Committee. Moore came through. At his suggestion, Pomerantz met with Senator John Chafee, a Republican from Rhode Island, and helped persuade him to hold a double-barreled hearing on the twin problems of ozone and carbon dioxide on June 10th and 11th, 1986. F. Sherwood Rowland, Robert Watson, a NASA scientist, and Richard Benedict, the administration's lead representative in international ozone negotiations, would discuss ozone. James Hansen, Al Gore, the ecologist George Woodwell, and Carl Wunsch, a veteran of the Charney Group, would testify about climate change. As soon as the first witness appeared, Pomerantz realized that Moore's instincts had been right. The ozone gang was good. Robert Watson dimmed the lights in the hearing room. On a flimsy screen, he projected footage with the staticky, low-budget quality of a slasher flick. It showed a bird's-eye view of the Antarctic, partly obscured by spiraling clouds. The footage was so convincing that Chafee had to ask whether it was an actual satellite image. Watson acknowledged that though created by satellite data, it was in fact a simulation, an animation to be precise. 3-minute video showed every day of October, the month during which the ozone thinned most dramatically, for 7 consecutive years. The other months, conveniently, were omitted. A canny filmmaker had colored the ozone hole pink. As the years sped forward, the polar vortex madly gyroscoping, the hole expanded until it obscured most of Antarctica. The smudge turned mauve, representing an even thinner density of ozone, and then the dark purple of a hemorrhaging wound. The data represented in the video wasn't new, but nobody had thought to represent it in this medium. If F. Sherwood Rowland's earlier colorized images were crime scene photographs, Watson's video was a surveillance camera catching the killer red-handed. As Pomerantz had hoped, fear about the ozone layer ensured a bounty of press coverage for the climate change testimony. But as he had feared, it caused many people to conflate the two crises. One was Peter Jennings, who aired the video on ABC's World News Tonight, warning that the ozone hole could lead to flooding all over the world, also to drought and to famine. The confusion helped. For the first time since the Changing Climate Report, global warming headlines appeared by the dozen. William Nierenberg's Caution Not Panic line was inverted. It was all panic, without a hint of caution. A dire forecast for greenhouse Earth, the front page of the Washington Post. Scientists predict catastrophes and growing global heat wave, Chicago Tribune. Swifter warming of globe foreseen, the New York Times. On the second day of the Senate hearing devoted to global warming, every seat in the gallery was occupied. 4 men squeezed together on a broad windowsill. Pomerantz had suggested that Chafee, instead of opening with the typical statement about the need for more research, deliver a call for action. But Chafee went further. He called for the State Department to begin negotiations on an international solution with the Soviet Union. It was the kind of proposal that would have been unthinkable even a year earlier. But the ozone issue had established a precedent for global environmental problems. High-level meetings among the world's most powerful nations, followed by a global summit meeting to negotiate a framework for a treaty to restrict emissions. After 3 years of backsliding and silence, Pomerantz was exhilarated to see interest in the issue spike overnight. Not only that, a solution materialized and a moral argument was passionately articulated by Rhode Island's Republican senator, no less. Ozone depletion and the greenhouse effect can no longer be treated solely as important scientific questions, Chafee said. They must be seen as critical problems facing the nations of the world, and they are problems that demand solutions. The old canard about the need for more research was roundly mocked by Woodwell, by a WRI colleague named Andrew Maguire, by Senator George Mitchell, a Democrat from Maine. Scientists are never 100% certain, the Princeton historian Theodore Rabb testified. That notion of total certainty is something too elusive ever to be sought. As Pomerantz had been saying since 1979, it was past time to act. Only now the argument was so broadly accepted that nobody dared object. The ozone hole, Pomerantz realized, had moved the public because, though it was no more visible than global warming, people could be made to see it. They could watch it grow on video. Its metaphors were emotionally wrought. Instead of summoning a glass building that sheltered plants from chilly weather, everything seems to flourish here. The hole evoked a violent rending of the firmament, inviting deathly radiation. Americans felt that their lives were in danger. An abstract, atmospheric problem had been reduced to the size of the human imagination. It had been made just small enough and just large enough to break through. Okay, guys, I'm going to read one more section, and I'm going to leave the rest for tomorrow. This is already going to be a very, very long video. Hope you're still with me. 4, atmospheric scientist, New York, New York. Fall 1987, spring 1988. 4 years after changing climate, 2 years after a hole had torn open the firmament, and a month after the United States had more than 36 other nations signed a treaty to limit the use of CFCs, the climate change Corps was ready to celebrate. It had become conventional wisdom that climate change would follow ozone's trajectory. Reagan's EPA administrator, Lee M. Thomas, said as much the day he signed the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, the successor to the Vienna Convention, telling reporters that global warming was likely to be the subject of a future international agreement. Congress had already begun to consider policy, In 1987 alone, there were 8 days of climate hearings and 3 committees across both chambers of Congress. Senator Joe Biden, a Delaware Democrat, had introduced legislation to establish a national climate change strategy. And so it was that Jim Hansen found himself on October 27th in the not especially distinguished ballroom of the Quality Inn on New Jersey Avenue, a block from the Capitol, at Preparing for Climate Change, which was technically a conference, but felt more like a wedding. The convivial mood had something to do with its host. John Topping was an old-line Rockefeller Republican, a Commerce Department lawyer under Nixon and the EPA official, and an EPA official under Reagan. He first heard about the climate problem in the halls of the EPA in 1982 and sought out Hansen, who gave him a personal tutorial. Topping was amazed to discover that out of the EPA's 13,000-person staff, only 7 people by his count were assigned to work on climate, though he figured it was more important to the long-term security of the nation than every other environmental issue combined. After leaving the administration, he founded a nonprofit organization, the Climate Institute, to bring together scientists, politicians, and business people to discuss policy solutions. He didn't have any difficulty raising $150,000 to hold Preparing for Climate Change. The major sponsors included BP America, General Electric, and the American Gas Association. Topping's industry friends were intrigued. If a guy like Topping thought this greenhouse business was important, they'd better see what it was all about. Glancing around the room, Jim Hansen could chart, like an arborist counting rings on a stump, the growth of the climate issue over the decade. Veterans like Gordon MacDonald, George Woodwell, and the environmental biologist Stephen Schneider stood at the center of things. Former and current staff members from the Congressional Science Committees, Tom Grumley, Curtis Moore, Anthony Scoville, made introductions to the congressmen they advised. Hansen's owlish nemesis, Fred Kumanoff, was present, as were his counterparts from the Soviet Union and Western Europe. Rafe Pomerantz's cranium could be seen above the crowd. But unusually, he was surrounded by colleagues from other environmental organizations that until now had shown little interest in a diffuse problem with no proven fundraising record. The party's most conspicuous newcomers, however, the outermost ring, were the oil and gas executives. It was not entirely surprising to see envoys from Exxon, the Gas Research Institute, and the electrical grid trade groups, even if they had been silent since changing climate. But they were joined by executives from General Electric, AT&T, and the American Petroleum Institute, which that spring had invited a leading government scientist to make the case for a transition to renewable energy at the industry's annual World Conference in Houston. Even Richard Barnett was there, the chairman of the Alliance for Responsible CFC Policy, the face of the campaign to defeat an ozone treaty. Barnett's retreat had been humiliating and swift. After DuPont, by far the world's single largest manufacturer of CFCs, realized that it stood to profit from the transition to replacement chemicals, the alliance abruptly reversed its position, demanding that the United States sign a treaty as soon as possible. Now, Barnett at the Quality Inn was speaking about how we bask in the glory of the Montreal Protocol and quoting Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken to express his hope for a renewed alliance between industry and environmentalists. There were more than 250 people in all in the old ballroom. As if the concentric rings extended any further, you would have needed a larger hotel. That evening, as the storm spat and coughed outside, Rafe Pomerantz gave one of his exhortative speeches urging cooperation among the various factions. John Chafee and Roger Revelle received awards. Introductions were made and business cards earnestly exchanged. Not even a presentation by Hansen of his research could sour the mood. The next night, on October 28th, at a high-spirited dinner party in Topping's townhouse on Capitol Hill, the oil and gas men joked with the environmentalists, the trade group representatives chatted up the regulators, and the academics got merrily drunk. Mikhail Budko, the Don, his name is not Mikhail Budko, The dawn of the Soviet climatologists settled into an extended conversation about global warming with Topping's 10-year-old son. It all seemed like the start of a grand bargain, a uniting of factions, a solution. It was perhaps because of all this good cheer that it was Hansen's instinct to shrug off a peculiar series of events that took place just a week later. He was scheduled to appear before another Senate hearing, this time devoted entirely to climate change. It was called by the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources after Rafe Pomerantz and Gordon MacDonald persuaded its chairman, Bennett Johnson, a Democrat from Louisiana, of the issue's significance for the future of the oil and gas industry. Louisiana ranked third among states in oil production. Hansen was accustomed to the bureaucratic nuisances that attended testifying before Congress. Before a hearing, he had to send his formal statement to NASA headquarters, which forwarded it to the White House's Office of Management and Budget for approval. Major greenhouse climate changes are a certainty, he had written. By the 2010s, in every scenario, especially the entire globe, has very substantial warming. Essentially, the entire globe has very substantial warming. The process appeared entirely perfunctory, but this time, on the Friday evening before his appearance that Monday, he was informed that the White House demanded changes to his testimony. No rationale was provided, nor did Hansen understand by what authority it could censor scientific findings. He told the administrator in NASA's Legislative Affairs Office that he refused to make the changes. If that meant he couldn't testify, so be it. The NASA administrator had another idea. The Office of Management and Budget had the authority to approve government witnesses, she explained, but it couldn't censor a private citizen. At the hearing 3 days later, on Monday, November 9th, Hansen was listed as atmospheric scientist, New York, New York, as if he were a crank with a telescope who had stumbled into the Senate off the street. He was careful to emphasize the absurdity of the situation in his opening remarks, at least to the degree that his Midwestern reserve would allow. Before I begin, I would like to state that although I direct the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, I am appearing here as a private citizen. In the most understated terms available to him, Hansen provided his credentials: 10 years experience in terrestrial climate studies and more than 10 years experience in the exploration and study of other planetary atmospheres. Assuming that one of the senators would immediately ask about his odd introduction, Hansen had prepared an elegant response. He planned to say that although his NASA colleagues endorsed his findings, the White House had insisted he utter false statements that would have distorted his conclusions. He figured this would lead to an uproar, but no senator thought to ask about his title, so the atmospheric scientist from New York City said nothing else about it. After the hearing, he went to lunch with John Topping, who was stunned to hear that the White House's ham-handed attempt to silence him. "Uh-oh," Topping joked, "Jim is a dangerous man. We're going to have to rally the troops to protect him." The idea that quiet, sober Jim Hansen could be seen as a threat to anyone, let alone national security, well, it was enough to make him laugh. But the brush with state censorship stayed with Hansen in the months ahead. It confirmed that even the political triumph of the Montreal Protocol and the bipartisan support of climate policy, there were still people within the White House who hoped to prevent a debate. In its public statements, the administration showed no such reluctance. But by all appearances, plans for major policy continued to advance rapidly. After the Johnson hearing, Timothy Worth, a freshman Democratic senator from Colorado on the Energy Committee, began to plan a comprehensive package of climate change legislation, a new deal for global warming. Worth asked a legislative assistant, David Harwood, to consult with experts on the issue, beginning with Rafe Pomerantz, in the hope of converting the science of climate change into a new national energy policy. In March 1988, Worth joined 41 other senators, nearly half of them Republicans, to demand that Reagan call for an international treaty modeled after the Ozone Agreement. Because the United States and the Soviet Union were the world's two largest contributors of carbon emissions, responsible for about 1/3 of the world total, they should lead the negotiations. Reagan agreed. In May, he signed a joint statement with Mikhail Gorbachev that included a pledge to cooperate on global warming. But a pledge didn't reduce emissions. Hansen was learning to think more strategically, less like a scientist, more like a politician. Despite the efforts of Worth, there was as yet no serious plan nationally or internationally to address climate change. Even Al Gore himself had, for the moment, withdrawn his political claim to the issue. In 1987, at the age of 39, Gore announced that he was running for president, in part to bring attention to global warming. But he stopped emphasizing it after the subject failed to captivate New Hampshire primary voters. Hansen told Pomerantz that the biggest problem with the Johnson hearing, at least apart from the whole censorship business, had been the month in which it was held, November. This business of having global warming hearings in such cool weather is never going to get attention, he said. He wasn't joking. At first, he assumed that it was enough to publish studies about global warming and that the government would spring into action. Then he figured that statements to Congress would do it. It had seemed, at least momentarily, that industry, understanding what was at stake, might lead, but nothing had worked. As spring turned to summer, Annie Hansen noticed a change in her husband's disposition. He grew pale and unusually thin. When she asked him about his day, Hansen replied with some ambiguity and turned the conversation to sports. The Yankees, his daughter's basketball team, his son's baseball team. But even for him, he was unusually quiet, serious, distracted. Aniek would begin a conversation and find that he hadn't heard a word she said. She knew what he was thinking. He was running out of time. We were running out of time. Then came the summer of 1988, and Jim Hansen wasn't the only one who could tell that time was running out. I'm going to stop right there and pick it up tomorrow. Thank you all for listening along with me. I may come back with another just regular old what's in the climate news video. I don't know how much more time I have today to devote to this. Thank you all for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. As always, I appreciate your comments and your discussion below in the comment section. If you'd like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until next time, peace.